Welcome everyone to Renew Illawarra Branch's online webinar with Davina Rooney. We're very lucky to have Davina with us this evening. She's the CEO of the Green Building Council of Australia as we explore the future of sustainable buildings in Australia. My name's Helen Lewis from the Illawarra branch of Renew. I'm joining you here from Northeast Victoria, but our panellists and our speaker and attendees are joining from Sydney, from the Illawarra, from regional Victoria and other parts. So in the spirit of reconciliation, Renew acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. So welcome once again. Before I invite our special guest speaker, I'd like to hand over to Dr. Fiona Gray, who is the new CEO of Renew, to just say a few words of introduction and welcome as well.
Thank you, Helen. Thanks so much. Thank you. What a joy to be here. I was just saying before we came on live that today is exactly 3 months to the day that I started at Renew, and what a whirlwind 3 months it's been. It's been incredibly busy, but incredibly rewarding, and it's a real privilege to be here. So thank you, Greg, for inviting me just to say a few quick words. I know that our members are the heart and soul of Renew. So having this opportunity to actually get to, even though I can't see many of you, but just to show my face and let you know that I'm here and I'm really looking forward to engaging you with is something that I'm really pleased to be able to do. And I thought I'd just sort of quickly take this opportunity to let you know a little bit about some of the fantastic work that Renew is doing and has been doing. Some of you may already have been attending webinars recently. We've had a whole series throughout October on Sustainable Design 101, which it's blown us away how incredibly popular that series has been. I think at the last webinar, we had about 750 people turn up. So there's a real thirst for that sort of information. So that's been going really well. And we're about to kick off tomorrow night with the next series for November, which is all about retrofitting for climate resilience. And that's really building on work that Renew has been doing for quite some time around the Green Rebuild Toolkit, which is about trying to make our homes more resilient in the face of bushfire. So tomorrow night's session is really the beginning of a month-long focus on that subject. So we'll be kicking off with looking at, basically where to start. Then we'll be moving on to how you deal with embers and radiant heat. And then we'll start to look at in the later part of the series, water and landscaping and your energy setups to deal with those sorts of situations. And then we've got another series happening in December, which is really exploring ways to make rental properties more sustainable. So something in our events lineup, which is all part of a much more expanded version of Sustainable House Day, which is actually happening in March. It used to happen earlier, but we've really expanded out the program. So it's almost now more of a sustainable house festival rather than the single day, but it will culminate in that big day in March. So I hope that many of you might be involved in that as well, and I might get to actually meet some people in person then. I also just wanted to quickly flag that we have our AGM coming up on the 22nd of November. So anyone who would like to be part of that, please, check your emails. If you're members, you'll be getting emails about that on how to register and attend to be able to vote and exercise your membership rights. And I think that's probably all I really need to say, because I don't want to hold up from the star of the show, which is Davina. I just will say that I actually had the privilege of going to Sydney a few weeks back, maybe only a couple of weeks back, to the Energy Efficiency Summit, and Davina was on a speaking panel there, and I think you're in for a treat tonight. She's highly knowledgeable and very engaging, so I will hand over to her, and thank you for the opportunity to introduce myself.
Thanks, Fiona. Fantastic to see you in the new role. Best of luck with that, and it sounds like you've got a pretty hectic schedule coming up. So I'd now like to introduce our special guest for this evening's webinar. Davina Rooney is CEO of the Green Buildings Council of Australia. Prior to this, she was General Manager, Sustainability and Corporate Procurement with Stockland. Davina's an engineer with extensive experience in sustainability and building, ranging from environmental projects, not-for-profit boards, and overseas community development work, spending 8 months working in the Indian Himalayas on the construction of a school, which won multiple international awards. I'd love to hear about that, but that's probably a talk for another day. Davina has been recognised by industry awards, including National Association for Women in Construction New South Wales Sustainability 2016, Property Council of Australia's 2014 Future Leaders Award, and Sydney University Engineering Young Alumni Award. And just before I hand over, just to mention to everyone, please think about questions as Davina's talking and pop them into the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many of those as we can at the end of the presentation. If you have any technical difficulties or problems, just pop that into the chat box, because we have a fabulous support person in David Wooten this evening. Hopefully you won't, but as I said, just pop your questions into the Q&A box, and we're looking forward to an engaging session after the presentation. So over to you, Davina.
Fantastic. Well, what a privilege to be here and with you all. I must say there's a very soft space in my heart for Renew. You know, the enormous work that you've been doing on the community side to make sustainability more engaging is just so fundamental, and it puts a heartbeat to sustainability in the property movement. People don't always want to hear from boring engineers like myself, and so the amount of engagement you bring to the space, and I'll talk about some of the areas that we've partnered with Renew, but it's been an enormous pleasure and a privilege. So one of the things that I've been asked to come and talk today is about, you know, what do we expect to see in sustainable building trends and future developments, what some of those aspects are looking like, you know, where it'll be going, how they go into buildings, and then open into Q&A, which will be even more fun if we have fabulous questions from you, especially the hard ones, and open and unpack some of the complex subjects in this area. So just to give you a little bit of context, I've been introduced as the CEO of the Green Building Council of Australia. Just to let you know a little bit about who we are and what we do before we jump in. So we're a not-for-profit organisation whose mission is to lead the sustainable transformation of the built environment. So we complete 4 key functions. We run the Green Star rating tool, which seeks to define what sustainability looks like, you know, a holistic sustainability rating tool that can be applied to fit outs, buildings, precincts, you know, communities at scale and existing buildings. So that's an area. Very happy to take questions about other rating tools that we partner with. You know, as long as we're all heading towards the same direction, that's the absolute aim. We do a large amount of advocacy work, which is where we spend time in Canberra or the different jurisdictions around the country, partnering with governments to try to implement sustainability regulations. And this will come up, obviously Renew and the wonderful Rob McLeod having an enormous role with the change of the National Construction Code for residential that we'll unpack a little more. But we do a lot of work at council, state, federal level to seek to take things that we see in the voluntary space, exemplified by some of the rating tools, and actually work those through in the regulatory context. We educate, so we partner with sessions like tonight. We run our own conferences, we run training courses. I was really impressed with the range of programs that Fiona was talking about, and it's great to do some of these things together. And then the most important thing that we do is we collaborate with our over 650 members who are from government, from consulting engineers, contractors, product manufacturers, owners, builders, everyone around the built environment context, so that we can actually work together, pool knowledge and ideas, and actually drive more change in this direction. Now, the most common thing is, you know, COP is on right now. And so a big discussion that we're all having is what you know, with the state of the climate and the biodiversity crisis and the issues that you'll also see at a local area in your jurisdiction, The thing I hear from sustainability professionals quite regularly is there's a lot of complexity in this space. Once I start doing things on one side, there's something else I need to work with. How do we actually map long-term trends in this space and make sure that we're aligning our work, you know, for where the global goals need us to be? And so one of the things I'd say is, referencing here the World Economic Forum each year puts out a report about what are the top global risks and how do we address them. Now, the thing that's really interesting in this space is what the short-term global risks are. Sometimes moves up and down a little bit, but when we move on to the medium-term risk and indeed the long-term risk, the thematics are enormously clear. You know, right at the top, we see climate action failure, extreme weather. So we see climate change. We then absolutely see biodiversity and natural resource crises culminating in resources and circularity. And we see the challenges around social, you know, cohesion, mental health deterioration that we've been seeing, really with health and well-being focus. Now, what's so interesting about the review that we're looking at here is that this isn't actually a sustainability materiality review. This is actually a review of all global risks. So this was published earlier this year. And what's fascinating is it was published basically on the eve of the invasion of the Ukraine. And what's fascinating, in long-term risk, economic confrontations, geopolitical resource contestation still is number 9 and 10 on the global long-term risk register, because, you know, if we don't have a livable planet, all of those items absolutely fade in consideration. So I also sit on the World Green Building Council board. So when we pull these strategy areas up, we talk about climate action, resource and circularity, health and well-being. And the reason why we reflect those in the global megatrends, the reason is that the work that you're doing, looking at the built environment, is a bit of a heartbeat of what we look at in sustainability. The reason why it's so important is the built environment is responsible for 39% of global carbon emissions. Buildings are responsible for 50% of all global material use on the resource side. And on the health and well-being side, you know, over 90% of locations, the pollution levels exceed the World Health Organization limits. I mean, we used to reference ourselves as the lucky country and say, you know, maybe not here, but the horror bushfires of 2019, 2020 taught us all a lesson, and something that we learned obviously in the pandemic is if we can't manage the health and well-being of our population safely within our built environment, then our reality changes quite suddenly. And whilst these statistics are stark, what's even stronger is that by 2060, the population is due to increase to 10 billion, and it's projected at this stage that global floor area will double. So the most sustainable building will be the one that we don't build. And so the focus on retrofitting some of the key programs that Fiona referenced, retrofitting, working with buildings as they are, completing all those kinds of works will be really fundamental as we go through this. But when we seek to unpack these different areas, you know, we're looking at how to make things net zero, looking at climate resilience, again, something that's coming up in a future webinar, embodied carbon. On the resources side, you know, obviously nature, biodiversity, an absolutely massive focus area as we look at the lungs of the earth, and always remembering the human element with this health and well-being side. You know, a lot of people talk about sustainability definitions, and the Brundtland report as being, you know, the keynote definition of sustainability, but a lot of people forget that it was the first sentence that talked about environmental sustainability. The second sentence was all about the need to bring the community with us, because without alignment and bringing the community, that social sustainability element and equity, we wouldn't be able to achieve anything. So, noting the enormous focus on climate, I just wanted to unpack a little bit about what that meant. And I note I've been tipped off some early audience questions about, you know, carbon neutral and how that all works in the built environment. Is that a good thing? What does that mean? So, you know, on the operational side, or scope 1, scope 2, the electricity that buildings use or other fuels, that we need all new buildings that we design, we need them to be highly efficient. We need them to be powered by renewables. That's got to be our baseline case. And this is really important because the built environment uses over half the electricity within the grid. So when we're talking about the energy crisis, there's a tendency to talk on the supply side, but there's a tendency not to talk about the things that use most of those energy, which is the built form, the space we spend more than 90% of our time. And then critically, we've got to look at embodied carbon or the upfront carbon emissions, the energy used to make the materials that go into the built form. And so by 2030, we need to have a 40% reduction of those materials. And by 2050, they all need to be eliminated or neutralized. And that gives us our whole life cycle. So that's one of the common areas when people talk about carbon neutrality, we really need to be looking at the whole carbon cycle. And so a real focus of some of the work we do is to align the built environment to meet our global goals. Those are the Paris Agreement. So what does that mean? Highly efficient buildings that are powered by renewables that are fossil fuel free. So this fossil fuel free or electrification in buildings is an absolutely huge focus at the moment. It was a real focus of the last IPCC report and the last International Energy Agency report, saying that we haven't been decarbonising fast enough. So to buy ourselves time, we need to really remove methane from the atmosphere, in particular as a focus area. So electrification has to be a critical area that we're working on. So that's why in Green Star, in our new rating system, it requires all new world leadership buildings, or what we call 6-star buildings, to be highly efficient, powered by renewables, and to have no gas in them, whilst focusing on reducing their upfront carbon emissions, requiring that to be measured and reduced across all asset types and offset with nature-based solutions. So, this just kind of shows how do you take that as an idea and how do you translate it into a timeline? Now, the reason why we're deliberately using these stepped timelines is because we're trying to take the work that the leaders are doing now, that they're finding hard to do, and then lift the whole market up so that we have enough space under the market to do the critical regulatory work, because we can't change everything unless we move things with everyone. And to do that, we have to move from the voluntary space to the regulatory space. But to arrange a staged transition in industry, we need to have a pathway where the leaders, or the kind of exemplars that Renew follows in your case studies, in your magazines, we need to get the light shone on them and then train everyone else so we can make that possible, because that's where we need to be everywhere. And I think it's the speed of this transition is obviously a key challenge, but the way I kind of frame it, it feels a little bit like I sit down with my son and we plan his assignments and we say we're going to do them slowly and steadily. And in reality, we don't. We end up doing it all at the last minute. That kind of feels like the last 30 years of climate policy. I used to be advocating for staged transitions, but at the moment, a little bit like the last night before my son's assignment, there's a bit of a disorderly transition. I actually feel that we're going to be in for a disorderly transition as we look at carbon policy, particularly as it relates to buildings. So when we look about how do you change the market, that idea of how do you lift the voluntary part of the system. So this just shows the exponential growth that we're seeing in partners that we're working with on the rating system, because we say, how do you change the market? You look at a carrot, a stick, and a tambourine. And so on the carrot side, voluntary rating systems like ours or other fabulous systems in the market are a great way to actually get people to lift the level. What we find in office buildings is they have higher valuations, they have better returns, people want to be in them more. So if you look at the incentives to have people do better things within their projects, the carrot. And on the residential side, we're absolutely seeing this. Domain did a great study showing that on average, homes were selling for $125,000 more, or 15% more if they completed efficiency work, which showing that valuation piece across multiple asset classes really helps for that carrot. The next piece is the stick. So how do we work to get the National Construction Code towards net zero? Now, the heartening thing in this space is many people aren't aware of this. This is a real kind of policy wonk kind of thing, but there's already a trajectory for low energy buildings. So there's already a staged trajectory to take the emissions of Australian buildings down to nearly net zero is the term. But highly efficient buildings powered by renewables is already a strategy that's been endorsed by the government. And this was agreed in 2019 by all ministers. The first version of that was rolled out and approved with the National Construction Code 2019 for commercial buildings. Excitingly, this year we had the residential construction code changes approved with enormous support from Renew. There is absolutely no way that we could have had the changes in the community space without Renew getting behind running a community coalition of a lot of social housing, affordable housing organisations and running a coalition for better. I remember in one of my early discussions in this role with Renew, it being made clear to me that Australians wanted to hear talk from real people with their real stories of what change looks like. They don't want to hear the progressive side of industry arguing tin tax with the less progressive side of industry. And to Renew's enormous credit, they had the heartbeat of industry behind what it looks like for better homes. Because I must say, if you're in a discussion about these things, some of the work that the University of Wollongong did with disadvantaged families, having children draw what it felt like not to be able to turn the heating on when you were really, really cold, that is obviously far more impactful to people than, than seeing a diagram drawn about the kind of energy transitions we need to have. Now, there's a lot more. So this regulatory change is about moving to 7-star NatHERS, which is the National Australian Housing Energy Rating System, a regulatory tool that's used for new buildings. It's been at 6-star and it's about moving it to 7-star. Now, noting we're in New South Wales Base 6, the New South Wales system uses NatHERS at its back end, and New South Wales has committed to align with this higher standard from next year. So we're seeing a lot happening in this space. So we talk about how do you make change? You have the carrot, the stick, and then we would say the tambourine. It's really important to have a sustained way to have people talking about change in a positive fashion. So we're part of a global coalition to have people sign up for highly efficient buildings powered by renewables that are fossil fuel free with a focus on embodied carbon. And this is all those groups saying they'll go net zero in operation by 2030 and that they'll go their focus will be that on the embodied carbon side from the materials from 2030 onwards. So we have over 3,000 buildings in that coalition, everything from as diverse as, the Opera House, City of Sydney, City of Melbourne, some of the big property groups. But I think what drives change out of this is if people say you can't actually lead these kinds of transitions for existing buildings, you have a look at something fabulous like the Opera House. The first engineering firm that I was ever blessed to work at, along with one of your Renew Wollongong members, was the Opera House. And if you can convert a building of that time, I don't think there's much that's more inspiring than hearing the team at the Opera House talk about some of the work they're doing, whether it's using caustic soda on the steps or scrubbing the brass or, how they do transitions in this space. It's, it really helps the rest of us put it in perspective. And so if someone says, I can't transition a building from the 90s, we say, the 90s, that's a young building. So when we look at the carbon from buildings, I just wanted to reflect a couple of seminal reports that are useful if you want to get up to date in this space. There's a 2019 report from the World Green Building Council that we partnered on called Bringing Embodied Carbon Up Front. And that report is setting out global goals, that 40% by 2030, net zero 2050. But importantly, it was about engaging manufacturers in that change. Within 6 weeks of that report coming out, one of the large steel makers, InfraBuild, committed to net zero by 2030, and we had Wholesome look at the first carbon neutral cement ranges. So, you know, it's important that we align industry, because a lot of what we're doing is creating a business case for the manufacturers to change. Speaking to another concrete manufacturer, they're low carbon concrete, where they optimize all their processes. They didn't have a business case for that in the past. Now everyone's enormously interested, so they're investing in this tech. It's increased its market share, you know, from 4% to about 20% in less than a year. So, you know, it's really important, the kind of focus that Renew and others are putting in this space. And then people frequently ask us, what does this mean in the Australian building context? And so we, the New Zealand government actually has embodied carbon regulations in place, and they worked with one of our partners, ThinkStep. So the Australian government asked us to bring the same reporting approach to Australia. So we partnered with industry to look at embodied carbon in Australia's buildings and why it's important. The reason why it's important is, at the moment, it's about 15% of emissions in the built environment. But as our grid decarbonizes, you know, with all the renewables coming in, it will move to about 85% of the emissions by 2050 if we don't do anything. And that's why we need to be incredibly focused on that now. So, as I've referenced, if you're going to work in the materials sector, you really need to be looking at the whole supply chain. You know, BlueScope, who's incredibly prominent in your local community, is someone we need to be looking at and working with. We spend a lot of time with the steel industry and other partners looking about how we drive this transition. They're part of what we call the hard to abate sectors in technical terms. What that means in English is sectors where we don't have all the answers. The technology behind green steel isn't fully resolved. And, you know, there's a lot of work we're doing. However, we have to send long-term change signals because these things require sustained research and development, manufacturing process principles. We need to ring the bell that now is the critical time for that to be occurring, so that it's ready for the future. And for those who are really engaged in this space, what's really important is that we're using international definitions for what those stages look like. So this is us drawing content down and aligning with European standards. Now for the fun stuff. What does this look like? What do some of these ideas look like in fabulous buildings? So this is this exemplar is from Darramoo House, which is in the Barangaroo precinct. Barangaroo, on average, well, it is highly efficient buildings powered by renewables, and it is was the first one certified, the first precinct certified carbon neutral under Climate Active scheme. And this is one of the exemplar buildings for those architects or designers amongst us. And I'm sure Fiona will be looking at the beautiful detailing in the corner here. Also, what's really important about this project, huge amount of Indigenous heritage partnerships. There's a gorgeous green roof on top, and they did one of Australia's first studies about how green roofs interact with solar energy. They were on average getting 7% better productivity because the green roof was making sure that the solar panels didn't overheat. You see all the tech that you would expect to see. My favourite part about this precinct is probably some of the waste systems. They've got organic digesters on site, and 17 different waste streams are collected. So there's over a 90% diversion from landfill for this building, which, you know, unfortunately the average Australian building is more around the 30% mark. And those are the systems we need to be enhancing. This precinct's also quite interesting and unusual in that they partnered with all the restaurants in the precinct to move to biodegradable takeaway containers so that those could be ingested by their on-site farm. So they also have beekeeping. So a very diverse and interesting view of what it looks like to bring some of these aspects to life. Another exemplar project is that's under construction at the moment. I saw the project director today is Atlassian Central Building. So this is due to be the tallest timber structure in the Southern Hemisphere. Well, when it's completed, which will be quite fascinating, all electric building, huge amount of biodiversity brought in, FSC timber, a whole range of water features, a spectrum of these kind of ideas across the space. So it's always really good to be able to visualize what do some of these fabulous projects look like. I probably should have put up another picture of a building called Aria in Brisbane that David Attenborough called the greenest, will be the greenest building in the world. The original vision was to have over 25,000 plants in the building and build out some of that greenscape in the city. And I think how we reimagine what development of different scales can look like, and how we can give back to the community. The building behind me in this image is from Burwood Brickworks, which is again one of our world leadership projects, which is classified as the most sustainable retail in the world, water positive, energy positive, targeting waste positive. That's obviously an enormous challenge and something they're working through, but they have their roof gardens that you can see behind me that they actually are using for some of the restaurants beneath. So a very different way of looking at design in operation. That one's a Fraser's project. So some good exemplars. Now, whenever we talk about trends, people always ask what's new, what's different, what's exciting. One of the things I wanted to note is we're starting to see change coming at scale. So the Sustainable Building State Environment Planning Policy was passed in New South Wales after a large amount of controversy. Now, from next year, that means basics upgrades. So the 7-star NatHERS, which aligns with the National Construction Code that we were talking about. But also on the commercial building side, it means net zero targets within buildings and monitoring of them thereafter, and starting to require electrification. Now, you know, this requirement of electrification is enormously important. Some of you might have seen the report that the Climate Council put out saying that gas in homes, both from heating and cooking, is the same health impacts on children for asthma as having a smoker in the house. So it's equivalent to passive smoking. So we're starting to see a whole range of reasons why we'd focus on this electrification agenda. And I'm very excited that with global partners, we'll be launching a CookSafe coalition within a couple of weeks, where we have people don't want to hear from people like me on what it's like to cook on induction. They want to hear from some of the celebrity chefs that we're going to be working with, groups like, you know, individuals like Neil Perry talking about why it's better to cook on induction, as well as being better for your health and better for the planet. Another area is, you know, it's a real focus for us on what we do in operation with buildings. So doing detailed work to understand what that looks like for building services, because there's a large amount of energy that goes into those. And been working with the federal government to take this focus on materials and bring Australian standards in their space, and calling out GPT as one of the partners who moved first in this space. So we are about to have the turning point in this discussion, where we're about to turn into a Q&A, and thank you so much. I can see some fabulous questions coming into the chat. So I've just put out a couple of ideas that we might like to talk about at that time, although I am sure with your questions we'll find a very wide variety of other things to discuss. So the first of them is how we have an ecosystem play. You know, how do we work together to change everything in materials? Because the reason why I love when we stimulate one part of the sector. You know, when someone like Boral changes the concrete mix to go into the Atlassian Tower, what's really important is they often change their range and it impacts everything all the way across to what we see in Bunnings that's turning up in family homes. So it's really worth acknowledging that on the material side, what we do in one part of, you know, it's the same concrete or steel or timber that we're using across the range of asset classes. So what we can stimulate in change in one part of the sector is leading to change across the whole sector. Something that, noting we're only having a half an hour chat, we haven't talked extensively about is how we look at circular economy principles. How, you know, essentially, how do we move from a linear system where we use something and throw it away to a far more regenerative system, and acknowledging the biodiversity climate that actually looks at an intense focus on regeneration in that spectrum. So the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, who's if you want more information on a bit of a primer for circular economy, there's a discussion paper that's freely available on our website that pulls out some of the key exemplars, pulls out some of the key principles, and references international research in this space. So the Ellen MacArthur Foundation looks at designing out waste and pollution, keeping products in use for longer. So often looking at how things are designed for disassembly, or if they're temporary, you know, how they can be pulled apart, used in other places, reconsidered, and an enormous focus on regenerating natural systems. And noting that, you know, sustainability in the past has been really efficiency focused. How do I do less bad? You know, we're moving a little more into the current space about it being embedded in early thinking, but where we need to be is that this regeneration at scale is the leading part of our strategies for us to have a sustainable planet. Now, something I get very excited about is, you know, how do we go from these concepts of net zero to zero? I mean, one of the big challenges that we have at the moment is, you know, if we look at one of these curves, we look at buildings' energy consumption being, say, this blue line in the top graph. But then what happens is we've got a large amount of renewables producing in the day. So the building's carbon ends up being this red line where it dips a lot during the day, but it's still incredibly high at night. We need to be working with building solutions to actually match the energy demand of the code the energy demand of the buildings, whether that's a combination of batteries or different, you know, cooling storage, or there's a whole lot of options here for us to look at. But if we don't manage to match the demand simulation, we're going to have the energy and supply crisis that's discussed, or, you know, our global friends at the Rocky Mountain Institute kind of characterize that if we don't work hard on building energy efficiency and matching the grid, then we're actually going to have to build a second grid. And that's a large policy conversation that Australia is having. But there's an enormous opportunity for distributed community solar, how that actually is fed back into the community so it changes our demand requirements. And someone very local to your jurisdiction, Saul Griffith, is obviously an enormous fan of talking about these spaces, but, you know, this has got to be a critical part of tomorrow, how we get buildings to integrate with, you know, electric vehicles or batteries on wheels, as they're sometimes called. You know, so we can absolutely go from there. The next thing is, you know, Renew spends an enormous amount of time in the residential space, which is enormously critical. Residential is obviously 57% of our emissions in the built environment in Australia, so a critical focus. One of the things that we've been looking at is when we've talked about sustainable housing, a lot of people have thought we're talking about less rather than, you know, how can they have a lifestyle that that they would love to have. And there's always a resourcing balance, and we critically need to look at that. But how do we make sustainable homes? When I look at Renew's magazine and the case studies, it's often a vision for better that inspires people. And so something that we've been looking at and doing quite a lot of work on is how do we actually sell the benefits of sustainable homes? You know, so this has a vision of, you know, what could be potentially one of my children, you know, where there's a discussion about, thank goodness there's natural light, because you're taking the screenager, you know, the preteen turning into a teenager and pulling them away from screens. So isn't it fabulous to be in a space with great air and light quality, or the crawlivore who can suck the carpet because it's, you know, low toxin materials, or, you know, celebrating what it looks like to be warm in winter, cool in summer, and actually celebrating some of those bill savings. So I think there's a need for boring engineers like myself to find the narrative that speaks to the Australian population when we talk about why it's better for everyone and for you to have a better home. You know, many of you will be aware that Australian homes are often affectionately, you know, called leaky tents, and the statistic that we have more deaths due to mild cold than in Sweden, you know, is pretty frightening considering, you know, the extreme differences in our climate. And then the last note that I will end on before we go to a discussion, and thank you, I can see some more questions coming in, will be really about the importance of nature-based solutions. You know, there's been, unfortunately, Australia is at the forefront of species loss, and, you know, a record that we can't be proud of. So what we need to be doing is looking at everything that we can do in our built environment, but we are going to need to invest in regenerating natural systems that have been so severely depleted during that time. And some of those will be in the built environment, like some of the exemplars that I've talked about, but we're seeing a biodiversity crisis of such a scale that I would just like to acknowledge the amount of work in nature-based solutions and regeneration outside of our built form that's going to be absolutely necessary for a crisis of the scale that we face. So that's the end for my formal remarks, but I wanted to thank you again for having me, and I'm really looking forward to your questions and perspectives.
Thanks, Davina. That was absolutely brilliant. I learned an enormous amount. And I love the fact that you switched around between really practical issues around materials and efficiency and renewable energy up to system transformation and regeneration, and linking the built environment to all of these really huge challenges and how we need to address them at a system level, well beyond just choosing one material over another. As expected, we do have quite a lot of questions that do range from the very practical to the big picture system transformation. So why don't we just start with some of the earlier ones. The first very practical one from Rob: how can we make wall insulation more common? More contractors, more techniques, and more reasonable prices. So assuming Rob's come up against some barriers in the whole wall insulation area.
This could not be any more frustrating. Sorry, not Rob's question, but the fact that in 2022, in the crisis that we're in, we still need to be asking it. So I think one of the things that we absolutely need to encourage is the fabric first discussion that Rob's leading, that it absolutely makes no sense to be talking about efficiency being cold in winter without, you know, doing your underfloor insulation, focusing immediately on those walls, the ceilings. Now, one of the things that we're obviously seeing is I'd like to call out the work of some of our partners at the Energy Efficiency Council and the Insulation Council for trying to do more work on training schemes and registrations in this space. So the thing that I would say we need, this is going to sound like an odd answer, but the thing that we need to do first, which we've now done, is improve the National Construction Code. Because when you change the National Construction Code, you change what all tradesmen, handymen are due to install. And so it actually just lifts the floor for all of industry. And so I think we're actually going to see an enormous change. Something that excites me is probably after the pandemic, people have realized just how uncomfortable their houses are. And we're seeing a huge swell of enhancements. You know, the Facebook page, my all electric home, my efficient electric home. I always get the acronym around the wrong way. I have never seen more public discussion in this space. So I think, Rob, we're on a pathway, but I totally agree that there's more work to do. And in the lucky country, we need to be doing more in this space. So I think the other part of this is rebates. So a lot of the green finance work that we do with banks at the moment encourages people for more solar. It encourages people to do heat pumps. We absolutely need to have those mechanisms changing for the fabric first idea that you mentioned.
Thanks, Davina. While we're on sort of practical building issues, Greg asks, for the new timber buildings, where is the wood sourced from and how sustainable is the supply chain? So I guess, yes, this is linked to the whole regeneration and natural environment as well.
So the Green Building Council partners with a number of sustainable timber sourcing partners, the most notable being FSC, and there's different supply chain validation in that space. I would have to note that hardwood timbers in Australia, in parts of Australia, particularly Victoria, are enormously, contentious. There's, a number of court cases at the moment around endangered species. And, I think we all need to be enormously cognizant of looking at the sustainability of the source of timber at the same time. And that's why looking at the sustainable timber certifications is really fundamental when you're looking at source. Plantation timbers, softwood is a lot easier. It's hardwood where the challenges are. So, looking hard at timber sourcing. Some of the enormously tall buildings that I was showing, they tend to be softwoods. They're laminated timbers where someone peels timber and glues layer on layer on layer of soft timber together. So they're more typically plantation forests.
Where I am in northeast Victoria, I'm surrounded by plantations, softwood plantations at the moment, which I hate the look of, but I keep telling myself it's sustainable timber. Hopefully.
Absolutely.
Just moving to rating systems, you have touched on obviously Green Star and NatHERS and Basics. The question from our anonymous attendee is, there seem to be a number of sustainable building rating systems. Are they all heading in the same direction?
Look, that's a really good question. What I might do is I'll post in the chat. So I would first like to acknowledge that sustainability is more confusing than we all hoped it would be. The fact that that there is confusion about the different rating systems, or in sustainability, I always joke that when you think about sustainability, there's always a new acronym. So if you're looking at climate change, there's the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD. As soon as you've got your head around that, there's work being done on TNFD, around nature. Now, these are all critical areas, but something that I will put in a typed answer to the sustainable building rating systems is ASBEC, the Australian Sustainable Built Environment Council, has done a phenomenal piece of work pulling out the frameworks on all the different sustainable rating systems across Australia and those that are used internationally. So one of the things I'd say is there's probably different classes of rating systems. So there's some that are single area. So our partners at NABERS, the National Australian Built Environment Rating System, they do energy or water or waste across different building types. Our friends at Passive House, who are enormously efficiency focused, they do incredible work, but it's focused on one attribute area, NatHERS, that we were talking about, energy envelope focused. And then there's some of the broader rating systems like Green Star that sort of look at energy, water, waste all together in a collective. I should also acknowledge the Living Building Challenge put out there's a Living Futures Institute of Australia doing incredible work. So I think the thing is all those rating systems are acknowledged in that document and kind of the areas they cover, the asset classes they cover. I think when I first asked this question 15 years ago, I asked this question, they drew me a triangle And I said, why the hell did you draw me a triangle? And then what they did was they sort of said, well, you know, at the time I worked for a developer that had so many asset classes, and they said, as long as they fit within the triangle of what we do and they're heading in the same direction and helping with our strategy, that's their purpose. Is if the strategy is aligned, the idea that you have at the start of the project, they're typically third-party validated, so they check whether you get there at the end. That's their purpose. So a rating system, once you've agreed strategy and alignment and concepts, helps you check that you go from strategy to procurement to impact. So a study we did with ourselves and neighbours discovered that if you followed our processes and actually followed it through the whole way, 89% of the time you got within 5% of the energy target or exceeded it. And so what that meant was, if you did it, it helped make sure you got there at the outcome at the end. Whereas the challenge is, and I know any of us who've been in property, you have these vision workshops where everyone thinks the world will happen. If someone doesn't write it down and check it for you and check that you get there at the end, there's a tendency to have a beautiful idea at the start and not quite get there at the end. A little bit like my son and his homework. If nobody checks it at the end, he has these beautiful intentions, but it doesn't quite happen. So I think one of the things that all of us agree on is verification means that there's enormous challenges. Without someone checking, you do what you say you'll do. Sometimes people get a little bit lost along the way.
Yeah, it's a complicated space. So that resource sounds really useful. The Australian Sustainable Built Environment Council.
Mm-hmm. I answered it live in the question, so it should be available to participants in a chat.
So you managed to do that while you were talking. That was well done. Okay, Amanda's asked us a question here. Are more universities other than Monash getting on board to collaborate and supply grads with capacity to deliver new codes and nudge the existing professionals in the system to transition to low carbon? You mentioned education, one of your areas of focus.
Yes, they are. So we've got 22 university partners. I mean, Bond University was an early exemplar in this space. You know, Monash is clearly a shining light. If we look at some of the work that the University of Wollongong's done, we're speaking about fabulous rating systems. They've got Australia's current only certified living building challenge precinct. So, living building challenge building in their innovation centre. We're seeing this, but like everything, we're seeing bright exemplars, but the challenge we really need is to see it everywhere, because the challenge we have is at a scale that we need to move everything at a scale.
Yeah. Okay. Moving on, does the Green Building Council have advice for cost-effective retrofitting of older houses in addition to your work with new builds?
So one of the big things that so from a policy level, we'll do policy and then we'll come down to practical stuff. At a policy level, the biggest problem we've got in existing houses in Australia is that I can tell you the energy rating of my refrigerator and I can't tell you the energy rating of my house because we don't have a national scheme for existing buildings. So one of the big problems is that means there aren't green mortgages or incentives in this space at the same scale as we see in other countries. This is something we're incredibly focused on. But on the absolute practical side, you know, the first thing, like our first fabulous question, is really looking at fabric. You know, you'd absolutely start from a fabric first perspective, looking at what you do in insulation across your building, be it ceilings, walls, if appropriate, depending on the construction type, underfloor, obviously an absolutely critical area. I'd note, obviously, LED lighting retrofits. If you're insane like me, you may choose to rip out your windows and retrofit them with double glazed windows, although that takes a certain amount of time and energy. Retrofits for electric and absolutely renewables, highly efficient taps and toilets. Look, if you're looking for somewhere to start in a bite-sized way, I really think it's fabulous. My Efficient Electric Home has a wonderful Facebook page, the wonderful resources out of Renew. There's a great Australian government website called My Home that talks about items in this space. But I know for myself in my own house, being part of a social media group, my Efficient Electric Home has kind of helped me for some of the residual challenges. You know, how exactly does one best put insulation under stairs in a really practical, effective way? If you want a video of someone doing it, my Efficient Electric Home will often have people chatting about that. They're up to just on 70,000 members at the moment. So, you know, that definitely inspires me in that space.
Great, thanks. Lots of ideas there. I love this question from Neville. He's gone straight to the heart of our economy and the system that you talked about us needing to transform. The World Economic Forum, does it acknowledge that economists have followed a mantra of endless economic growth, which is a root cause of climate change and non-sustainability in general? Is this being addressed in the building sector and more generally? Now, there's a big question for you, Davina.
Well, in my reading of the work of the World Economic Forum, I personally haven't seen a large amount of self-reflection of their role. However, I think these are just tools that we use to help people see trends. We're not endorsing their worldview on a lot of other areas, but it's quite interesting where the economists see risks that would bring that world crashing down. And I think that this is one lens that we would use. You know, another lens that we could use is looking at the International Energy Agency or the IPCC on our global challenges in this context. The thing that's quite interesting is how aligned those worldviews are becoming. You know, often in my day-to-day, I speak to financiers or people that own large amounts of real estate or groups from the government perspective. So it's sometimes most effective to hear something in their own language, in their own words, although I do agree with Neville that, you know, I could equivalently show a lot of those contexts coming out of, you know, I referenced the Brundtland report on sustainability way back in the day, which is a far more authentic source for sustainability, which drew pretty similar conclusions. So good point, Neville, well made.
It's interesting how much of this discourse is now becoming mainstream, isn't it? I occasionally read the Financial Review, and it's like every second page now. It is about these risks, whether it's climate or other environmental issues. It's just changed enormously in the last 5 or 10 years. It's really mainstream, and the fact that it is economists now talking about this as part of the normal discussion on risks in the economy. Back to a practical building issue from Anonymous. Are there systems to better recycle demolition waste? Are they being used? Obviously, we've still got a lot of demolition waste going to landfill in Australia.
So I'd have to say that looking at a systems approach in waste, there's systems that go from the bloody obvious to quite sophisticated. And so I would actually note that some of the obvious solutions are currently still being left on the table. I saw a report from one of our partners, Corio, today, where they had a new innovation that I applaud, but falls in what I would call the bloody obvious category, where they hand out bags to builders who, when they've finished the tiles, they put all the tiles in a bag and see who in the community wants them rather than throwing in the skip. So I would say that's a low-tech option. One of the things when I speak to groups like some of the partners at the University of Wollongong, I know have been focused on what I would call high-tech options. And so what I find really interesting in that space is if there's any asbestos in any materials, the entire thing is classified as dangerous waste and thrown out, regardless of the percentage. So some of the leading universities have been looking at what would it take to heat those materials to turn them back to glass so that the remaining material source could be, you know, used a lot of what we hear out of Europe is moving to renting materials, like renting facades rather than buying them. So at end of life, maybe 30, 40 years down the line, someone comes and picks up that facade so they actually know what it is. Another big focus is on QR codes so that people know what they're picking up. And we're spending quite a lot of time working with those in, one of the biggest problems we have in landfill out of the construction industry is carpets. And so working out how the different carpet manufacturers can work together. When someone rips it off the floor, you don't always know what it is, but how they can work together on a product stewardship scheme to actually pull this back in place so that there's a streamlined pathway out, so that, and in some cases there'll be recycling them for different product use, potentially insulation. So I think there's a good question. Are there systems to better recycle demolition waste? Absolutely. And I think with the changing tech, we're going, the thing that inspires me is waste solutions that used to require a whole warehouse and now requiring a solution that might be the size of a washing machine. So that might be, organics. You can have digesters now that are about the size of a washing machine, or one of my favorite examples, Dresden Optics, where they 3D print glasses from ocean plastic. So my pick is that this is one of the spaces where we're going to see the most innovation with AI technology and really smart machinery over the next period, particularly as materials become a lot more expensive.
Yeah, that's interesting. And this is an area where we'd love to see more product stewardship. I mean, we've seen a lot of product stewardship for appliances and packaging and all sorts of e-waste, but really the building sector hasn't really come into that space, has it, apart from vinyl flooring and a few other bits and pieces, but definitely something that needs to be pushed along. Now, Amanda, I'm not sure whether this is a question or a statement. You probably answered my question with the concept of ecosystem changes in one part of the system facilitates the butterfly effect. I guess that was one of your comments you put up at the end of your presentation. Did you want to add anything on that?
No, I think we're, though, at the stage of the crisis where we've got to be looking past a single building, a single rating system, a single anything, that how do we actually get that scale system changed? Because the time for that in the marketplace is over. When we look at the criticality of the crisis we're facing, we've actually really got to be looking at, what this looks like at systems level transition.
And as you said, so many of these issues are linked. The embodied carbon in buildings linked to the whole climate change area, biodiversity, etc. We can't look at these things for, as separate issues. We need to start looking at a system. Now, there's only one last one here. You've been doing a sterling job, Davina. You're probably running out of voice. This last question from Carolyn and Rodney. How much emphasis is the Green Building Council placing on regeneration and restoration of environment after building developments?
It's a really critical thing for us to think about. At the moment, we're doing a study with Deloitte on nature-based solutions to do a biodiversity roadmap for the built environment. So it's a critical focus of ours, but it's one that we all need to be doing a lot more in this space. So, I would say 5 years ago, we called out that the pathway for net zero for highly efficient buildings powered by, we needed to have a pathway in that space, and spent a couple of years consulting with industry and driving change. We've always recognised nature in the 20 years of the Green Building Council, but we're at a stage where even all the beautiful greenery you see in a development behind isn't enough to resolve the biodiversity crisis. We need to actually be looking at more scale solutions, and it's an enormously complex time to be talking about this, noting that Andrew McIntosh appropriately went whistleblower on some of the regeneration schemes that we have in Australia, and we're currently having a federal review on that. That's a really important conversation because we need to be opening pathways. I was sitting down with one of our partners today who was buying up Arnhem land and working with Indigenous rangers for the restoration of it. That's part of where we need to be for the damage that's being created over generations, and we're going to need to find pathways to recognise that, noting that nobody wants greenwash, or that the system changes and the review that's happening needs to be completed, and we need to have that done so that there's a clear, transparent, verifiable way to recognise better, because there needs to be a pathway for the recognition of regeneration in biodiversity.
Yeah, it's so important. I mean, it's shocking seeing the outcomes of some of that research on how many of those offset projects are just rubbish. Talking about greenwash,
So
or project failure. Yeah,
that's one part of project failure. However, the construct of that system, that we have biodegraded land, that we actually need to increase its biodiversity value, both for, you know, natural systems benefits and to be the lungs of the earth. That's a problem we need to crack, and the fact that it's a problem doesn't mean we can shy away from it at this stage of the biodiversity crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, we'll make this the last question, Davina. You've been doing a fabulous job answering all these questions that are going all over the place. Been really interesting questions. Thank you, everyone. The last question from Jeff: how much CO2 reduction is being achieved in green concrete so far? How long will it take to achieve actual zero carbon concrete?
Well, actual zero carbon concrete exists now. It's just not being used at scale. You know, so some of the different polymer blends that don't actually use lime as an active ingredient. So we're seeing the first green concrete now. What I would actually say is, we're going through a stage transition. So I'd say, you know, Wholesome have the first carbon neutral certified concrete. Now that is a combination of efficiency within the cement mix, using blast furnace slag, fly ash as, you know, cementitious substitutes. However, absolutely acknowledge in those concrete ranges, there's still carbon offsetting, ideally through high quality nature-based offsets, but there is still offsetting at that scale. What we need is the technology to enhance. So some of the Wagner's green concrete solutions, for those of you who want to look them up, we're starting to see really exciting cementitious blends. Now, this is a really critical space. You know, concrete's about 8% of global emissions, so really fundamental in that space. So what I would actually say on that context is, you know, I did my first embodied carbon report a little over 20 years ago when I was a graduate in an engineering firm, and it wasn't an enormous focus then for manufacturers to drive change. It's an enormous focus now, and I think it's going to be over the next couple of years that we're going to actually start to see those technologies coming to scale at a more impactful level. One of the useful things about offsets within cement mixes is it actually ends up being a shadow carbon price, meaning that it costs the company more to pollute that way, and it actually makes them invest far more heavily in different research solutions of scaling things that come out of efficiencies. And we're seeing huge innovations in that space, whether it's you know, efficiencies in process, renewables in how they run their own processes and framework, different, you know, we're seeing an enormous amount of area there. But this is, you know, if I said what are the hot areas to watch in 2022, 2023 as they emerge, watching the core materials of steel and concrete as the technology evolutions happen in that space. So I will close with saying thank you so much for having me. What a privilege to have a broad discussion. And again, the Renew community gives so much back to Australia, you know, be it volunteers, be it your wonderful team in your offices, be it working with community collaborators. Thank you for everything you do, and keep the fabulous questions coming, and look forward to collaborating further in the future.
Thank you so much, Davina. It's been a fabulous session. So yeah, once again, just thanks for taking the time, especially in the evening when you've probably had a full day at work. Before we close, I'd just like to also thank Fiona Gray, the CEO of Renew, for her words earlier on. A big thank you to Greg Knight from Illawarra, or the Renew Illawarra Branch, who organised tonight. Anne Brown, who came up with the idea to invite Davina along tonight, which was a brilliant idea. And also our tech wizard, Dave Wooten, for ensuring the Zoom webinar ran smoothly. So And thank you all to the attendees. Thanks for all your great questions, and have a good evening.